Hi everyone, thank you for joining us for another short video series, this time on emergency preparedness. This week, our healthcare consultant Shannon Hines will walk us through emergency preparedness by leveraging your CMMS. Shannon?
Thanks, McKinley. Today we're going to take a look at how we're going to use various tools within our CMMS in relation to emergency preparedness. As everyone knows, CMMS came down with a final ruling back in September of 2016 about emergency preparedness and plans that your facilities need to have in place with regulations coming into effect this past November. This will now be part of your survey. So what we want to take a look at is how we can use our CMMS systems to help prepare with our emergency preparedness plans, as well as documenting different things that we need for our survey at hand. Today we're going to focus kind of on three different areas as part of the provisions that need to be in your emergency management plans. We're going to take a look at risk assessment and planning, how to leverage the system when we're looking at our policies and procedures, and how we can document some of our training and testing that we now need to do as part of this preparedness. The first thing I want to talk about is how we can use our scheduled work orders, our PMs in our systems, to create documentation that we need for our emergency preparedness plans. This way we have some clear, concise documentation in place for reporting and other survey documentation that we can use later on. We're going to take a look at three different activities that we can use our CMMSs as part of that. Tracking and training activities, documentation review, and then planning with our emergency equipment. The first is going to take a look at our activities and training exercises. Now these are drills that the facility needs to do as part of their preparedness plans, of which maintenance is going to have a key factor in. There's kind of 3 or 4 functional areas that we're going to look at as far as the different activities, whether or not they're tabletop drills or full-scale events that encompasses everyone within your facility as well as community members from outside. As well as other drills that you guys may have to do throughout the years, like fire drills. So setting those up with our scheduled work orders, we're able to document the actual tasks and procedures that were taking place during those actual drills, attach any key players as far as communication with email notifications going to those individuals, and setting them up on a recurring basis so that we have that documentation in place that yes, we're doing this yearly, making sure that we maintain that consistently year over year as part of our compliance. There's a lot of flexibility with the tools here to be able to document exactly what needs to happen, to include additional documentation or forms, attach pictures of the event as it's happening, as well as put post-note events in there so that we can use this as far as part of our review of our emergency preparedness plans later on to make sure that we are actually getting the full benefit out of this information. Next, we're going to take a look at some documentation review. And this is something that probably seems a little outside kind of the realm of what we use our scheduled work orders for. Most of the time when we talk about scheduled work orders, we're using them in reference to our regularly scheduled maintenance on our equipment or assets, on some of those drills and surveys and inspections that we do in our areas. But what we can do is leverage the tool to start looking at the different policies and procedures that we have in place. Most facilities have review timelines as far as when we have to go back and actually review our policies and procedures. And this just gives us the ability to make sure we're documenting it, making sure we're doing that in a timely manner without needing to remember to do it. And as well gives us a place to kind of store a lot of that information, because again, we can start attaching documents to these work orders, to our scheduled work orders, so that we have them in one place. We can use it as far as making sure our vendor contracts are in place, putting reminders in there for ourselves to reach out to our vendors, especially when we're looking at our emergency events. So if we have policies and procedures in place for vendors to bring in water or other supplies, making sure we have all that contact information in one place, that our policies are all lined up, and all that information is stored in our system so that we have it handy in the event of an emergency. The same thing too with our equipment inventories. Building in these scheduled work orders to keep track of those equipment inventories to make sure that maybe on a quarterly basis we're going through and we're reviewing any new assets that we've added into the system, retiring any assets that we've removed, making sure as we get into different seasons, whether or not it's into the winter and there's specific equipment that we need to have on site, or into our summer months where if we're in areas where hurricanes are an issue, having that pieces of equipment kind of readily available, and just building it in as kind of like a checklist just to make sure that we know everything is in the right place it needs to be, and that we have all the information, tools, supplies handy going forward into those seasons or into those potential events going forward. The other thing, again, is taking a look specifically at our emergency equipment. Of course, these are going to be items that we're always going to have our regular PMs on them, as far as any regularly scheduled maintenance based on our manufacturer recommendations. But adding in secondary PMs before seasonal use if we need it, just to double check that in fact we have all the parts on hand that we may need if something were to break, all the additional supplies that may be needed if we're going into the winter months and we're using snow blowers on our site, making sure that we have all the fuel that we need on site for those in preparation for a weather event. Just keeping kind of track of everything that's needed beyond just that regularly scheduled maintenance of these items that are going to come in handy as we go through these events throughout the year. Additionally, just checking to make sure that they're in the right location, that we know where they are within our building, and even moving them to a handy place in the event that there is some sort of weather or other emergency that will need this equipment. So it's just about documenting and checking off and making sure that these things are actually happening going forward, and helping to do this with our CMMS so that, again, we are building that nice detailed documentation that we like to have in place. One of the other tools that we're going to take a look at or talk about is our survey and inspection tools. This we, again, use a lot for our environment of care rounding throughout the year in our different clinical and non-clinical spaces. But using those tools to leverage for preparing for our emergencies, whether or not it is taking a look at high-risk areas, checklists for events, for weather events before those events are to happen, or again, even checklists of supplies. So taking a look at kind of our high-risk areas before an event, or even as part of our annual review of our emergency preparedness plans, it gives us the ability to kind of outline criteria that we want to check for in these areas and create work orders in the place in the event we have something that needs to be corrected. And this will give us the ability to do it right on the fly as we're inspecting those areas. Again, as part of those reviews of our emergency preparedness plans year over year, to document any changes that we see, to be able to fully use that data to reflect on next year's review of the plan. So we'll want to take a look again at some of our high-risk areas like patient care areas, the major exits and entrances to our hospital, so we don't have any means of egresses that are blocked by any debris or anything. Taking a look even just at the command center that will be set up and kind of having a checklist to make sure all the pieces that we need together are there, check it off, make sure we have it on site going forward. And then again, areas that are going to be vulnerable to damage, even checking, making sure that, you know, before a major weather event like a hurricane, if we get up on the roof and check for areas that may be susceptible to leaking, or even just securing or making sure that all the parts of our equipment on the roof are secure so that nothing gets blown around in wind and things like that. So it's just a matter of helping organize as we're preparing for some of those stressful events that are going to have a lot of moving pieces beforehand, getting it documented, getting things corrected, keeping kind of track to see if we have any trends as far as areas within our buildings that we need to review year over year as we adjust our plans going forward. We can even use those checklists more specifically in the event that we have like a weather event coming. So this year, North Carolina got hit with a lot of hurricanes. So kind of taking that as an example, using a checklist to kind of review our grounds and our buildings for things that could potentially happen during hurricanes. So if we're outside the building, checking to see if our entrances are clear of any low-lying branches that may come down in a storm, going through kind of any of the items that are outdoors that can be removed inside, or anything that can't be moved inside, securing it. So it's just a matter of creating checklists and checking those off, and then creating additional work orders if needed, so that we're documenting that we're correcting this and kind of checking off everything as we're going, crossing all our T's, dotting all our I's, if you will, as we're going through, kind of focusing on some of those vulnerable areas that could be open during those weather events, to kind of hire, kind of make some of that before the event even happens. And then additionally, kind of taking a look at even supplies that we may need. Again, a lot of this time we're talking about this in reference to maintenance, but this is tools that other areas could use as well. As far as going through and checking to make sure that we have all the supplies on hand that we may need for our emergency events, going into hurricane season or going into the winter, making sure that if there are additional supplies we want to make sure that we have on hand. Making sure those supplies are in areas that will be helpful during the event so that we don't have to walk completely across the building to get more salt or sand for an entranceway in the event of a winter storm. Making sure that there are tools and parts just kind of handy in those places that if something were to happen, we can quickly react to that instead of needing to take longer time to go find things within our buildings. We can also use this as far as some staff education, as far as reviewing with staff in certain areas that during an event, if something were to happen, if there was an event that requires maintenance or some other department, how to document that, how to get that notification to the other departments within your facilities. So it's again about taking these tools that you already have in your hands and kind of expanding it and thinking outside that box as far as using those scheduled work orders for other items besides just our regularly scheduled maintenance, stuff that we may do seasonally, stuff that we want to review on a regular basis. And then using our survey and inspection type tools, again, to create those checklists and additional work orders and alerts that we can send to other departments and places in the event of pre-storm preparation or review of areas as far as our emergency preparedness plan goes, and have that documentation and data to leverage later on. So this is part one of our two-part series on emergency preparedness with your CMMS. Our next session is going to focus on our post-event documentation and reporting and how we can use our CMMS to leverage that data.